All right, guys, so here we are, as we say every single time, back to our philosophy of religion discussion. And we're going to go ahead and get right into our talk for the day. Now, what we're going to talk about is going to be we're going to launch into our some of our atheistic arguments, right, and the philosophy of religion. Now, as again, I'm just going to briefly go through so many of these the because what I wanted to be the thrust of this course was to introduce you to material that you maybe have not been exposed to much previously. Because in the now that we're in an age of apologetics, there's so many popular arguments that are being thrown out, offered up, and that's not I don't mean that pejoratively, but there's so many of those, and conversely, so many arguments contra theism that you hear that are tossed up and thrown out, that I'm not going to try to spend so much time on this again, because the point of this course is I want to introduce you to something new, something for the most part that you're not getting in, say, some other apologetics course and whatnot. Now, having said that, we're going to combine the problem of evil argument and with various incoherence arguments against the existence of God. So let's go ahead and look at some of these. Now, as we've briefly made mention of this before, but if any of our arguments for theism, right, were to run, that is to say, were the conclusion to be actually true, the argument runs, then it doesn't get you to the position that God probably exists. It doesn't get you to the conclusion that theism is more likely true than not true, right? Those are not the style of arguments that we're trying to offer up here, right? Or that the originators of the arguments are trying to give you, rather. The point is that if the arguments work at all, if they're true at all, then theism just is necessarily true, right? Now, the same must be said in regards to atheism, right? These particular types of arguments are not going to try to just get you to the point, try to get you to the belief that uh, that God probably doesn't exist. In fact, if you're an agnostic, you're already there anyway, right? I mean, maybe, maybe not. I mean, so what good does that argument, just gives you more I don't know-ness, right? To make up a word there. So if these types of arguments work, these incoherence arguments or the logical problem of evil, if that argument works, then it just means that there's not, at least that's the aim of the argument, it just means that there's just not a God, right? That would be the point of these types of arguments. So just to read that particular portion of the slide, it says, arguments for atheism proper must reveal that there is no God, as opposed to probably no God. Though we will look at one in particular. So I'm actually glad that I reminded myself to, or read that. It reminded myself to make mention of the fact that we are going to look at an argument that is not necessarily concerned with saying there is no God, but wants to try to make the belief or the possibility that God is there, that he exists, just as irrelevant as if there were no God. And we'll look at that in due time. Now, first, let's go ahead and look at, because this has been an issue within the philosophy of religion. Around the 40s or 50s, 1940s, 1950s, there became a movement that was within the philosophical community that was ingenious in one sense, but then is going to have some detrimental effects as well. But the ingenious move was to redefine atheism. So let's go ahead and look at that as we talk about, as we start to talk about or get into this section in regard to atheism. Now, you may be very familiar with this new definition of atheism. Now, the new definition of atheism, well, first, the old is just there is no God, right? The commitment to the truth of the proposition that there is no God, right? Atheism just is not just the belief that there is no God, but atheism is a commitment to the truth of the proposition that there is no God, right? Now we're getting a little more nuanced, right? However, this new definition was Atheism is simply a lack of belief in God. Atheism just is the lack of belief in God, right? This was this new or this revised definition of atheism. Now, why does that seem to be relevant? What seems to be important in that regard? What would it matter if we simply allow for this new definition? Now, there's quite a lot actually. So first, the genius of this argument or this redefinition was to simply remove the burden of proof, right? So if I say that I have a lack of belief in God, well then all of a sudden I'm not making any positive statement about reality, right? I'm not making any particular claim about the nature of reality. And if I'm not making any particular claim about the nature of reality, then I don't have to give an argument for that because it's a non-claim, right? I'm just saying atheism just is a lack of belief in God. I, as an atheist, have a lack of belief in God. Well, what's your argument for atheism? Well, I don't have to give you one because I just have a lack of belief, right? I don't have to go into some sort of argument. There's no burden of proof on the atheist in that sense if atheism just is a lack of belief in God. Now, notice, though, in contrast to the claim that there is no God, right? Well, that's a positive claim about reality for which an argument must be made, right? If I make that sort of claim, well, then now I have to shoulder the burden of proof and give some sort of argument as to why, when I say there is no God, why should anyone believe that statement at all, right? Why should anybody believe that proposition? Why should anybody be given to the conclusion that there is no God, right? So this redefinition, though very subtle, was ingenious in the sense that it was supposed to relieve the atheist from having to shoulder some sort of burden of proof. Now, there's some major difficulties with that revised definition, and you see here in the PowerPoint where I have atheism versus atheism, right? Atheism representing the revised version, a new definition that still is popular on the internet and so on. There's a couple key problems. First, it would be this. If I say that I have a lack of belief in God, and that just is atheism, that just is what it means for atheism just is by definition a lack of belief in God. Well, notice that doesn't make any statement again about reality. So if it doesn't make any statement at all about reality, then why should we as philosophers, as thinkers, why should we be concerned with statements that don't make any claim about reality? So in other words, look at it this way. If atheism just is a lack of belief in God, that is simply a statement about someone's own personal psychology, which is just, philosophically speaking, just uninteresting. I'm not concerned with your own personal psychology. I'm concerned with what is true or not true in regards to reality, right? That's just a statement about your own psychology. Now, think about this, right? Think deeply about this. If atheism just is a lack of belief in God, and that's true, right? Well, then could theism be true, meaning could God exist, and atheism be true at the same time, in the same place, in the same sense? Well, yeah. Because it could be true that you have a lack of belief in God, and so therefore atheism is true, and simultaneously it could be true that there is a God. Right? It could be true that God actually exists and atheism is true because atheism just is a lack of belief in God. So that gives us the conclusion that both atheism and theism could be true at the same time, which again is just very odd to say the least, right? Well, okay, great. You lack a belief in God and that's true. And let's say that somehow it's revealed that God actually does exist, right? At some future point. Well, that's just really, to put it mildly, right, to put it a bit crudely, that's just ridiculous, right? That's a bit silly, absurd, that atheism could be true because it's a lack of belief in God and theism be true at the same time. Now, think about it, though, in another way. This is the second big problem here, and this may be even more substantial than that. Some have pointed out, just kind of a side note here, some have pointed out that if atheism just is a lack of belief in God, then your cat can be an atheist, and a dog can be an atheist because they just have a lack of belief in God. But what good is it to say that cats and dogs are atheists? And it just doesn't have any bearing on anything. We can say that. We can try to interpret it a little more charitably and say, well, a human person or something like that lacks a belief in God, right? So that may be a charitable way to try to save it from that objection. Needless to say, here's the second point that seems to be very difficult here. A very difficult point, very substantial critique, is that if atheism is a lack of belief in God, this revised definition, right? If atheism just is a lack of belief in God, well, that statement itself, put on your thinking caps, that statement itself, atheism is a lack of belief in God, is really neither true nor false. Wait a minute, what? All right, so think of it this way. Let me ask you, is the statement, atheism is this proposition, lack of belief in God, is that true or is that a false proposition? Is it true or false? Lack of belief in God, is that true or false? It's neither, right? It doesn't even have the privilege of really even being either true or false until you predicate it of something, right? So you can say, does Dan or does Jill have a lack of belief in God? That can be either true or false, right? But that's, again, notice you had to predicate atheism upon something in order for it to even be true or false. Just by itself, if atheism just is, definitionally, atheism is a lack of belief in God. That is neither true nor false. Think about it this way. Is the statement lack of spaghetti true or false? Lack of spaghetti. It's not true or false, right? It doesn't even have the privilege of rising to the level of either even being true or false unless it's predicated upon something. So, I could say Dan or Jill has a lack of spaghetti, right? That could be either true or false, but it's not even true or false until it's predicated upon Jill or Dan or whoever, right? So it just seems that, that's just completely useless. This new definition is completely useless. It doesn't say anything about reality. It's only a statement about your own psychology. And really, unless you predicate it of something, it's not even true or false at all anyway. So it's better just to say with the old school definition of atheism, which is just the commitment to the truth of the proposition that there just is no God, right? And try to argue for that. Whether you like it or not, just try to argue for that, as opposed to try to take a side door out or jump out the back door and not have to defend any particular belief at all. So let's look at a couple of these incoherence arguments. First, what are they supposed to do, right? Incoherent arguments are supposed to give you the fact that God can exist for some various reasons. So usually it's going to try to pit the omnis of God one against the other, right? These attributes of God that we would normally call or dub the omnis, like omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence, right? Omnibenevolence, all those sorts of things, right? It's supposed to show you that those are impossible, and because the Christian conception of God, the Judeo-Christian conception of God, classically holds to those attributes, that it can't possibly be the case that God exists because they don't even make sense, right? So these would be expressed in something like this, like the playground objection. You'd hear as a kid: can God lift a rock so heavy, or can God make a rock? There's really a kind of a typo there in the slide, but basically, can God make a rock so heavy that He cannot lift it? Right? Because the problem is supposed to be, if God can make a rock so heavy that He can't lift it, well then, either way, God is not all powerful. Right? Because if He can't make the rock, well, then there's something that God can't do, right? However, if He can make the rock so heavy He can't lift it, well, then there's still something that He can't do, namely lift the rock. So either way, if God can't make it, He's not all powerful because there's something He can't do. But if He can make the rock, He's still not all powerful because He can't lift it, right? He can make the rock that He can't lift, so there's something He can't do, so He's not all powerful. Now, the problem with these sorts of arguments is that they smuggled in this conception of a two-ness there, right? And then argue that because there's not a two-ness, then God can't be something. So really, you're having to pit God against God. And so if God wins, well, then God wins, right? But if God wins, then God loses at the same time. But notice that this is, again, the objection itself is what is incoherent, because you can't pit a person against themselves and then claim because they lose against themselves that they lose against themselves. Because again, if you lose against yourself, then you obviously just win against yourself. So I don't know if we want to say that that's self-defeating, but it's just logically incoherent, right? Now they would say, aha, that's exactly the point. This is that God is incoherent, right? So he can't possibly be these sorts of things. But Greg Koukl makes he makes an interesting observation that I think is helpful here. And he says basically this. He says, it would be like asking, can God beat himself at arm wrestling, right? And then trying to say that if he beats himself in arm wrestling, he's not all powerful. But if he does beat himself in arm wrestling, then he's still not all powerful because he lost against himself at arm wrestling. What? Right? So you're saying, ha ha ha, see, imagine if God is the supreme arm wrestler, right? I don't know we could create some sort of, we could delve into the etymology there and make some sort of Greek, create some sort of Greek or Latin equivalent of all-powerful arm wrestler, right? I'll probably get an email or a response to one of you guys that do that. But notice that again, that's incoherent because you're pitting God against himself. There's nothing in reality outside of God that is limiting God, which is really what you need to keep God from being from being omnipotent or all powerful. It's like saying, yes, we concede that no one can stop you. You're the all powerful arm wrestler. Yet you know what? You're not really the greatest arm wrestler because you can't really beat yourself at arm wrestling. And even if you did beat yourself at arm wrestling, then you would have lost. Right. So imagine, my son, right, at my physical prime, which I'm not anymore, probably obviously, but at my physical prime, I could bench press 225 roughly 8 to 10 times, right? Now, let's say that my son comes into the gym who is 4 years old, and he literally is 4 years old. So imagine he comes into the gym and he says, hey, Dad, I can do something that you can't do. And so therefore, because I can do something you can't do, I'm more powerful than you, right? And I'm like, oh, wow, well, what is it? And so he says, put 225 on the bar, right? And so let's say we load up the rack with 225. And then he proceeds to, if he can even get it off the rack, right? And then it immediately falls down and crushes him in the chest. It splits him in two. And then somehow miraculously he's not dead. And he gets up and he says, see, Dad, I can do something you can't do. I can fail to bench press 225. You can do it. But I can do what you can't do. I can fail to actually be able to do it. And so, see, that's something that I can do that you can't do, so I'm more powerful than you. Right? You see, at that point, it's just a silly semantic game. Really, so you're more powerful than I am because you can be crushed by 225. There's something that I can't do. You can do that. Okay, that makes you more powerful. You see, at that point, it just becomes a silly little semantic game, and there's nothing there, right? The weakness would be if you couldn't, right? The strength is not that you can't do it. The strength is that you can, all right? And so when we cash it out in arm wrestling, how Greg Koukl likes to give the arm wrestling example, or if we cash it out in some sort of bench press analogy thing, the weakness is not the strength, right? And that's essentially what you're having to do is propose that the weakness is a strength. And since you have the strength of weakness, then there's something that God can do. And it's the same with any of these, right? Specifically the last one, can God sin? Can a morally perfect being? Really what you're having to say is, can a morally perfect being be morally imperfect, right? Which is a contradiction. You see that that's just there's a contradiction there, right? Of course, the argument's supposed to be, can God sin? If he can't, there's something God cannot do. On the other hand, if he can, then obviously God is not all good because he can sin, right? But again, that's like saying, that's like asking, can a morally perfect being be morally imperfect? Because if he can be morally imperfect, then that's better than, that's something, a strength, an ability to do something that the other couldn't. Again, that's like the bench press thing, right? Just, you can't do that. That's silly semantics, right? Now, one of the more interesting ones might be this middle incoherence argument here. Something like, can God know what it is like to be me? Because if God can't know what it's like to be me, well, then God is not all knowing, right? Now, the problem again with that is, and I have reference here to Nagel in this back thing. There's philosopher Thomas Nagel writes an article, an essay, very famous now, called "What It's Like to Be a Bat." And essentially, and it's a short, quick read. Go check that out if you have time. But essentially, what that Nagel is saying is that you can't literally, in principle, know what it's like to be a bat. You might, because you just are by definition not a bat, right? So you may know what it's like for a human to feel like a flying around through the woods. You may know what it's like for a human to try to use sonar. You may know what it's like for you to try to navigate blindly, with your echo sonar, whatever what I just said, right? You may know what it's like for you to try to utilize all these other sorts of things, but you can't know what it's like to be a bat because you are you, right? Just the law of identity. A is A. And A can't be not A, right? Because that would break the law of identity there. It's just contradictory, right? So it would just be logically impossible for God to know what it's like to be you in the most strict sense, right? Because God is God, right? So it's not an issue of whether or not God is all powerful, but that's a matter of logical coherence, right? Again, you probably know most of this, and we'll even talk about this problem of evil. It's not that because God can't do the nonsensical that he's not all powerful. It's because there's nothing there to do, right? Nonsense remains nonsense, even if we speak it about God, right? As C.S. Lewis famously said. It's like saying, logically, it's like saying, can God welcome beautifully? Right. Logically, nothing was stated there, right? And so if you watching the lecture are you, well then per the law of identity, just per basic principles of logic, well then you are you, no matter what else you try to experience, you just by per the law of non-contradiction are you, right? Now we'll get into that when we talk about the problem of evil. Now the problem of evil is supposed to be the big, right, incoherence argument. Most of the others aren't necessarily taken that seriously by theists and atheists alike. Of course, there are some that will try to offer them out. But the problem of evil, the logical problem of evil, I should say, was supposed to be the big incoherence argument against the existence of God, right? Now, it's essentially summed up like this. It seems unbelievable if an omnipotent and omnibenevolent God exists, that he would permit so much pain and suffering in the world. So, what's supposed to be the problem here? Before we get to that, let's go ahead and distinguish a couple types of evil. Again, I'm going to try to fly through this because I know that you're already getting a lot of good material in some other courses here. But it's philosophy of religion, so I'm going to go ahead and mention it because this always comes up and needs to come up in the philosophy of religion, obviously. First, we have to distinguish between moral and natural evil, right? Moral evil would be the stuff that human beings are responsible for, right? The things that occur because some moral code has been violated, right? Someone steals, it causes some sort of pain or suffering. Someone murders, it causes someone pain or suffering. Someone makes some sort of poor moral choice in any regard that causes some sort of pain or suffering, even if by mistake. Natural evil, again, would be things like tornadoes or, whatever the case may be, tsunamis, earthquakes, just something as simple as a tree branch that falls right onto a child, something that is not directly, at least in print, at least in theory, not directly responsible due to some sort of human intervention, right? That humans aren't necessarily the cause or the creator of, right? So that would be something like natural evil. So we're going to concentrate for the most part on moral evil, but even natural evil will come up. Now, there's also an important distinguishment. It's not even a word. There's an important distinction between the intellectual, the logical problem of evil, and the emotional or a pastoral problem of evil. And the reason that we just want to quickly make reference to this is because the intellectual problem of evil is something that we deal with in a classroom, right? Or deal with purely on at least supposed to deal with purely on a philosophical or logical basis, right? The emotional problem is not the responsibility of the logician, right, or the philosopher, as it comes to argument, right? Meaning that you can't go up to a widow at the funeral of her husband and try to launch into some sort of philosophical argument as to why God might allow evils, or not allow evils, but how evil and the existence of an all good God are not mutually exclusive, how God can actually exist and evil can actually exist at the same time. You're not going to launch into that at a funeral, right? I mean, clearly that's not the time to go into the intellectual problem of evil. That would be the time to try to emotionally support somebody who's suffering through, right, the problem of evil. And it's important that we keep those two things in mind, because there's so often that thinkers or philosophers or just whatever stripe of Christian or theist, they want to run up to a person who's suffering emotionally and try to just go into some diatribe, right, about philosophy and whatnot. And that's just not what they need at that point. Now, you can easily argue, and I would argue that they did need that, but now it's too late. Once they're in that, you're just going to have to roll with them and ride with them till they get out of it. Then maybe you can discuss those things intellectually. But these things are supposed to be addressed before you enter into that type of situation, right? Ideally speaking, right? Ideally speaking, you introduce people to these topics before they have to suffer the emotional, right, the existential part of the problem of evil. And conversely, you don't want to go to a philosophical debate or into a philosophy course or lecture room with someone who's trying to think this through intellectually, and then give them some sort of emotional response, right? And it just doesn't work, right? Anybody can give an emotional response for anything, right? So there's a time and a place for each of these to be addressed. Now, we're going to focus on the logical problem of evil here, right? And again, I'm trying to fly through this for you guys, because again, I know you're getting a lot of this somewhere else. Now, the philosophical problem of evil is not new. I mean, this has been around since the time of Epicurus, right? This came back up again in the time of David Hume, right, in the 1700s, in the Enlightenment era philosophy. And one of its strongest, most modern advocates would have been J.L. Mackie, right, in the 50s and 60s of the 1950s and 60s. But David Hume has a very succinct way of putting this, and so we can kind of just look at his version of it, even though these are all traceable to the same type of argument here. Now, it's basically worded something like this. Is God willing, but not able to prevent all evil? Then he is impotent, right? Meaning he's not all powerful. He's not omnipotent, right? Is God able, but not willing? Then he is malevolent, meaning that he is not omnibenevolent, right? He's malevolent, right? He's not all good. So, is God both willing? He wants to get rid of evil, right? And he's able, he's powerful enough to get rid of evil. Well, why then there's evil, right? There's evil. So basically, to translate it, it's supposed to be something like this, right? If God is all good, then he would want to get rid of evil. If God were all powerful, then he could get rid of all evil. But there's evil. So either God is not all good because he would want to get rid of evil, right? But he doesn't. So he can't be all good. He could be all powerful because he could do it. He just doesn't want to do it. Or he's all good. He really does want to get rid of evil, but he can't do it. So he's not all powerful because we have evil. So either way, either God is not all good or he's not all powerful. Or more likely the case, this argument really wants you to get to is that there's just not a God, right? Because if you're willing to just to toss out one of the attributes, then you're really not even talking about the classical conception of God anymore anyway, right? Okay, well, yeah, all right, I just accept he's not all good. Or okay, I accept he's not all powerful, right? Those just aren't options for the classical theist, right? Now, very quickly, we could go into a theodicy, and we want to make sure, though, that we don't do that. Because, again, most Christians, when they hear something like that, that particular type of problem, they will go into a theodicy. But remember, a theodicy is not appropriate yet. Now, a theodicy is a justification as to why God might allow some types of evils to happen. But remember, first, there needs to be a defense, meaning that there's no inconsistency with the fact of evil and what the theist is going to argue, the fact of God's omnipotence and omnibenevolence, right? God's all power and God's all goodness, being all good, all powerful and all good, right? First, that has to be solved. You can't move into why married bachelors might allow something to happen, because first you have to show, because you realize that, wait a minute, it doesn't matter how you try to give justifications to why married bachelors may allow things to happen, because there are no such thing as married bachelors, right? So first you have to show that it's not incoherent to say that an all good and all loving God exists, an all powerful God exists, and there's evil. First, you have to show that that's not There's no logical tangle there. There's no logical incoherence there. Then you can go into your theodicy, right? So many Christians will immediately go into the theodicy first. Well, why God might allow evil. But remember, the atheistic argument is not asking why God might allow it. It's saying that the very concept is like saying there's a married bachelor. Saying that you believe in an all good, all powerful God and there being evil around is like saying that you believe in a married bachelor. So first you have to show that you've got to detangle that argument and show that it's not like believing in a married bachelor. Then once you show that it's not like believing in a married bachelor, then you can go into a particular theodicy, why God might allow something, right? So there are all kind of answers to this problem, right? If you've taken your the philosophical problem of evil course and writing a whole course on this already, then you may have read, Paul Feinberg's book that says, well, depending on your theology, then there's all sorts of answers to this. But we're going to look at the most popular version because this gained lots of traction within philosophical communities, atheistic or theistic. And that would be Alvin Plantinga's free will defense, FWD here. And that's going to be roughly this. Again, I trust that you guys are getting a lot of this somewhere else, but if not, just so you know what's going on here. His free will defense roughly goes like this. When there's thought to be a contradiction between P and Q, these two premises, right? One need only present a third premise, R, such that when combined with P, it actually entails Q. So what does that mean? So P will say God, we'll see that premise. That first premise would be this: God is omnipotent and omnibenevolent. Q, evil exists. Now, here's where we introduce this third premise, R, that actually, when you combine this with those two, it actually entails that evil exists, right? And that third premise would be this: God created a world with significantly free creatures. Now, what we want to make sure that we highlight here is that when Plantinga argues this, his point is essentially, his point is basically that, look, it may be logically possible that God creates a free world, or let me say a world in which free creatures just all do the right thing, right? He may be able to look through possible world scenarios, right? If we're looking at possible world semantics here, P1, P2, P3, P4 represent each logically possible world. And it may be logically possible that there's this one world here, say P432, that it's possible there that everybody's free and they just always happen to do the right thing, right? He concedes that may be logically possible. But Plantinga's point, too, is it's also just as logically possible that there may be a world, right? Or not a world, but there may be, across all logically possible worlds, there just is none in which everybody does the right thing all the time. It's just as logically possible that there not be a world in which free creatures do the right thing all the time. And this, if you see the fine print here in the argument, is due to what's called transworld depravity. Plantinga introduces the idea of transworld depravity, that it may be the case, it may very well be the case that across all possible worlds, they have transworld depravity, right? And this is basically, let's look at it this way. There may just be a possible world and that at some time in some place that people just didn't eat from the tree, right? To go their own way, rebel. There just may not be any place in which they decided to do the right thing, right? So another key point that we want to look at here in regard to this argument is that Plantinga really wants to make mention that it's a logical contradiction to say that God can make, right? Let's use the word force so you don't think of the make as synonymous with creating. Let's use the word force. Plantinga wants to argue that it's a logical contradiction to force a free person to do anything. Think about that. Plantinga argues that it's logically impossible to force someone to do something freely, because if you're forcing them to do it, then they're not doing it freely, and if they're freely doing it, then they're not being forced to do it, right? So Plantinga wants to argue that if human persons are, and this may even go for non-human persons, say like angelic beings and whatnot, that if God really did create free, significantly free creatures, then that just means to say that God can't force them to freely do things, right? And because he can't force them to freely do things, then there may just not be, it may not be feasible for God to construct or create a world in which free creatures always do the right thing, right? Because he can't force them to do so. Now, a word about omnipotence very quickly, because some, again, I know this will be old hat for many of you, but for some, you might say, well, wait a minute, omnipotence, God can do anything, right? If God truly is all powerful, then he can do anything that he wants to do, including making free creatures do something. But remember, omnipotence does not entail the logically impossible. And just to show you that this is not ad hoc, this is not something that theists or Christians came up with in response to the problem of evil. This was already what they had traditionally believed. So again, you look at Hebrews 6, 13 through 16. You look at other various aspects of Scripture where it talks about there's things that God cannot do, right? So it says that not just that God doesn't lie, like he could, but he just doesn't. It says that literally, God, it is impossible for God to lie. Well, why? Well, if God is truth, as that Scripture maintains, right, as Scripture maintains, and God is truth, well, then it would be incoherent to say that God, being truth, can lie, right? No, God cannot lie, right? So the weakness would be if God could lie, right? There's another passage that says, because there is no name greater than God's name. He swore by a name. He swore by his own name because there's no name higher for which he can, right, swear. Now, that's logically impossible, therefore, for God to swear by a name higher than himself because there's just not one, right? It's not a weakness in God to say, well, God can't swear by a name higher than himself. Aha, there's something you can't do. Well, because there's just not one, right? So, again, the concept of swearing by a name higher than the highest name is just incoherent, right? Truth not being able to be not truth is incoherent, right? These are just meaningless concepts. So let's look at this as masterfully done by someone like C.S. Lewis. This is just very succinct, very well done here. Look at this quote. I'm going to read it to you in length. His omnipotence, meaning God, that means power to do all that is intrinsically possible, not to do the intrinsically impossible. You may attribute miracles to him, but not nonsense. There is no limit to his power. If you choose to say God can give a creature free will and at the same time withhold free will from it, you have not succeeded in saying anything about God. Meaningless combinations of words do not suddenly acquire meaning simply because we can prefix to them the two other words, God can, right? So let's say real quickly, you can't say, what does the color number 7 smell like as it's talking to its grandfather falling down a hill? What? That's just a meaningless combination of words. Now, the reason that can be tricky to some is because you haven't broken any grammatical rule necessarily, right? You can say that grammatically, but logically that sounds like this. Nothing has been said. It's just an absolute mishmash of goofiness. It's nuttiness, right? Put into vernacular form, right? There's just nothing has been said. You can say it grammatically, but you haven't said anything with meaning or content or logically. Nothing has been done. And so you can't say, God can. What? The power is not that there's something that God can't do. That's the very problem. When you say that sort of stuff, there's nothing there for God to do. Nonsense is not a thing. It's non-sense. It's non-entity. It doesn't exist, right? So, back to the quote. It remains true that all things are possible with God. Note the key word, all things, right, are possible with God. The intrinsic impossibilities are not things, but non-entities. It is no more possible for God than for the weakest of his creatures to carry out both of two mutually exclusive alternatives, not because his power meets an obstacle, but because nonsense remains nonsense even when we talk about God. Right? Now, some of you may be thinking right now, well, wait a minute, what about when Jesus says with God all things are possible? Right. Jesus says all things, right? Nonsense making married bachelors is not a thing, right? There's nothing there to be made. It's incoherent, right? So it's true that with God, as Jesus states, all things are possible, because all things which are possible, God can do, right? Married bachelors, right? Square circles, those aren't possible because they're not things, right? Now, here's the crazy thing that happened in the logical problem of evil. This never happens, very seldomly in philosophy. This was conceded, right? J.L. Mackie, the most current notable defender of the logical problem of evil, conceded the argument to Flanagan. Again, this just doesn't happen. And I just wish we knew. I wish you guys were familiar, and you may very well be. But if you're not, this is just, again, this just comes along once in a couple of millennia, literally, that philosophers of all stripes will say, for the most part, generally speaking, well, yeah, okay, this one's solved. This one, let's dust it. It's done. This one's solved. And so Mackie here, I got this picture from Richard G. Howe, another philosopher. But he says, this picture states just eloquently, atheist philosopher J.L. Mackie on the logical problem of evil, we can concede that the problem of evil does not, after all, show that the central doctrines of theism are logically inconsistent with one another. This is Mackie conceding the problem, which doesn't really ever happen, right? Now, I want to look at a couple just alternative types of solutions to the logical problem of evil. Geisler has a way of doing this where he basically just says all you have to do is add in information that solves the logical problem of evil. So he might say something like this, not yet. He would say basically that if God is all good, then he does, or excuse me, you can say it this way, if God is all good, then he desires to get rid of the problem of evil or be rid of evil. And because God is all powerful, he will, right? Not that he is, but remember will, the not yet aspect. And if God is all powerful, then he will get rid of evil. Therefore, we can conclude that evil will be eradicated, right? Now we could clean it off and put that in a much more tight syllogistic fashion, right, in the form of an argument there, a form of a deductive argument. But basically the point is just that, well, if God is all good, and if God is all powerful, then we know that God will eventually get rid of evil, right? Then there won't be any problem. In fact, you might even say that you toss in the omniscience of God, right? The all-knowingness of God, that because God knows some particular purpose, and God is all good, and God's all powerful, well, then he knows what he's doing, and then he will therefore get rid of evil or whatever. There you go. But I really like this. This is just a theistic thinker, Ravi Zacharias. It's so simplistic, yet it's so unbelievably powerful. And it says this. This answer is to the atheist or the theist that would want to try to get rid of logic in order to try to solve this problem. So let's say that the atheist says, well, wait a minute. You're telling me, let's say you go back to the omnipotence thing, about what it means for God to be omnipotent. Imagine that the non-theist thinker is saying, well, wait a minute, I'm not buying all this stuff about God not being able to do the logically impossible. If I'm telling you, if God is all powerful, I don't care what you say, God being all powerful, then he has to be able to do the logically impossible. Otherwise, I'm not going to accept any argument that you have. Well, Zacharias says, well, wait a minute, dude. Like, if you do that, right, well, then your problem immediately flushes down the toilet. How? Well, because the problem is supposed to be the logical problem of evil. It's supposed to be logically impossible for a all good, all powerful God, right, to exist parallel or coinciding with the existence of evil, right? But if you want to say that God can do the logically impossible, then the theist can simply say, okay, God can do the logically impossible. He can simultaneously be all good and all powerful and evil exist, because if God can do the logically impossible and that's logically impossible, well, then God can make evil and all his all goodness and all powerfulness exist simultaneously, and you don't have a problem because he's doing the logically impossible by making something that's logically impossible happen. You see just the simplicity of that? So if you're an atheist or a theist, you don't want to get rid of logic, and you don't want to toss out that definition of omnipotence, especially if you're an atheist, because it's just going to immediately backfire, right? Well, God has to be able to do the logically impossible. Okay, what's logically impossible for God to exist with and coincide with evil when he's doing it. He's doing the logically impossible right now because he can do the logically impossible. And then the problem immediately is flushed down the toilet, right? So that's just another really neat way to look at the problem of evil if someone tries to dismiss what it really does mean, what classical Christian teaching has always said in regards to omnipotence. If they want to dismiss that and say, well, no, God can do the logically impossible, well, then the problem immediately disappears, right? Now, because the logical problem has been done away with, there's been, of course, people are not going to just roll over and give up on that, right? So now the evidential version, and it's going to say this: if God exists, gratuitous evil does not exist. Gratuitous evil does exist, therefore God does not exist, right? And gratuitous evil is bad things that happen for no purpose at all, right? There's just some particular event X happened, and that was completely in vain. There was no point to that at all. So therefore, it can't possibly be that God exists, because if God exists, there wouldn't just be pain, there wouldn't just be purposeless, vain instances of evil that happen. But here's the problem with that. I think that you can grant the truth of the first premise, even though some theistic philosophers would say that's not necessarily true. But in my own opinion, I think that you can grant the truth of the first premise that if God exists, then yes, purposeless evil doesn't exist either. Things that happen in vain, there's no event like that happens just completely in vain, right? But I do think that number two is just false. Because if it's shown, right, that the logical problem of evil is done, meaning if it's shown that there's no incompatibility with saying that God can exist, and an all-powerful, all-good God can exist, and evil can exist, if that problem is broken, if that's conceded, which it is, well, then we're just not in a position to say whether or not some particular event is gratuitous. We may not know the purpose or the reason why God might allow that. You may not know it for many years, right? Decades even. We may not know, but it doesn't follow that because you don't know why some particular event happened. It doesn't follow that because you don't know why some particular event happened, that there was no reason for that particular event happening. And again, I'm not trying to dismiss that and say, oh, yeah, there's an obvious reason as to why. No. The point is just simply that if the logical problem is broken, then the second premise here just doesn't have a leg to stand on, because we're just not in a position to know the purpose or the reason for some particular event or whatnot. Again, it just doesn't follow logically that if you don't know the reason of the purpose, that there's not a reason of the purpose. In fact, this has been shown. I'm not even trying to make an argument in some other for something else here. Some of you may think I'm about to do that. I'm not. But this is also just true, easily in regard to vestigial organs, right? We've had organs that we thought had no purpose at all, and then later to find out that they did. So it didn't follow that because we didn't know that there wasn't one, right? Again, don't look too deeply into that. I'm not trying to make an argument in some other area. I'm just saying that there's one example of things that we didn't think had purposes that do, right? Now, and by the way, that's not defeated, because I know somebody's probably thinking, yeah, but we did think this and it ended up not having, sure. But if there's just one instance of us not knowing something and it later came to light that there was some sort of purpose, that in itself is enough to show that there's sometimes that we don't know, and it doesn't follow that there's not one just because we don't know for the time being. Whatever it is, substitute your own example there, right? So there's a probabilistic version, right? Well, it's because there's so much evil, right? Because there's so much pain, suffering, and all these sorts of things, then it probably is the case that God doesn't exist. But again, this is just like the second premise in the last argument. We're just not in the position to know. Again, if the logical problem is broken, then we're just not in any sort of position to know why or why not some particular events may or may not happen. In fact, as noted here, we've got to take seriously other cumulative aspects of the existence of God. You can't look at the existence of evil and the existence of suffering or particular events that happen in a vacuum, right? So if any of the arguments that we've looked at thus far in the course, or any of the arguments that you've looked at in another course, if any of those types of things, if any of those arguments run at all, if any of those work, well, then you have to look at the problem of evil in the context of all these other reasons to think that it's true that God actually exists, right? And if you have all of these other independent reasons for thinking that God exists, well, then you have to look at that, the fact of evil, in light of all of the other evidence that God may actually exist, right? And then two, this MSR here, this seems to imply this probabilistic version and the gratuitous version of the argument slide above this seem to imply that there's just no morally sufficient reason, MSR there, that God might have for allowing some sort of evil to event, some sort of pain, some sort of suffering. Again, we're not trying to dismiss that. We're trying to think of this intellectually right now, not emotionally, right? So we just don't, again, we're not in the position to know whether or not God would have a morally sufficient reason for allowing particular events, right? Now, some would argue rather that Christian theism seems to entail that there is a problem of evil. Now, wait a minute. Some may say, well, wait a minute, what now? Like, if God is all good and God's all powerful, I thought the fact of evil existing would be, an argument against God's existence. Well, no. Remember, if you know the full context of what, say, Christian theism teaches, well, then Christian theism seems to say that you should expect that there is a problem of evil, namely because of a couple of these reasons right here, right? Let's look at the second first. Number two, that mankind is in a state of rebellion against God and his purposes, right? So if it's true, if Christian theism is true, that man has rejected God, has gone his own way, decided to eschew God and God's will, God's purposes, and do his own thing, right? And he's in this active state of rebellion, well, then it shouldn't be a surprise if things have gone wrong, right? And when we say that things have gone wrong, that's just a euphemism to say that evil has resulted, right? In fact, if you think about it, it may be Kukl that says this again, maybe Greg Kukl that says Christianity just is a response, all of Christianity just is a response to the problem of evil. If there wasn't evil, then there wouldn't even be this whole saga of God breaking into the world to try to make things right, which he will eventually do in Christ, right? According to Christian theism, right? Now, some of these other reasons might be the chief purpose of life is not happiness, but knowledge of God. Another way to say that is the chief purpose of life is not necessarily happiness, but holiness, right? And these would be your soul-making theodicies, right? That God has particular reasons for allowing these things because he's making you into a certain type of person. Not that the things themselves are good, right? No one is saying that you have to claim some evil event. Oh, well, that's a good because of this thing that it brought about. No, the event in and of itself can still be labeled correctly as wrong, as evil, as bad, but God is working, turning some sort of event that is bad, right, that is evil, and using that for some good purpose, right? Three, God's purpose is not restricted to this life, but spills over beyond the grave into eternal life. And then I may mention this later, it's just my own, what I would call a minimalist theodicy. And then maybe I can go into an example of that towards the end. However, there's a couple other problems when the non-theist uses the problem of evil as an argument against the existence of God. And that is just namely that atheism cannot legitimize the argument. It cannot ontologically ground its own objection. Well, why? Well, I'm convinced that there just is no moral framework on which atheism can stand metaphysically, meaning that there's no moral theory on atheism, any ethical theory on atheism that can ground truly objective moral values and duties. Yet the argument, the problem of evil, assumes that it really is objectively evil that that all these things are going on, right? That there's actually evil in the world, that these instances, you can think of all sorts of atrocities and point to those particular things as real wrongs that have gone in the universe. There are really evil things that are going on in the universe. But remember, on atheism, the universe just is. There is no way to think that things ought to be, right, on atheism. The universe just is what it is, right? There is no standard, right? There is no blueprint by which the universe was supposed to be going this way. Some person's life was supposed to be going this way, and then something happened and it's not, right? There was no blueprint, right? There is no grand overarching plan or purpose for the universe. The universe just is, and whatever happens just happens. Now, you may like it or you may not like it, but there's no standard. So again, we're going to look at C.S. Lewis here because he says this so succinctly and so elegantly, um, that it really captures what we're saying here. So what I've been saying is something about the moral argument, right? Um, Basically, the moral argument for God's existence, if you recall from another course, is just simply that in order for true objective moral values and duties to exist, then there has to be a God, a real standard by which that we're judging certain behaviors. But if there is no standard, right, there is no objective problem of evil. There is no problem of evil because nothing really is evil, really. It just is what it is, right? So let's look at this quote from Lewis here. Again, he states it so nicely. Now, this is Lewis before his conversion to Christianity, right? Before his conversion to theism proper, I should say. He said, my argument against God, basically, was the problem of evil. My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel, so unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? Right? This is from his popular work, Mere Christianity, right? So Lewis is looking around at the universe. He's thinking that things are going wrong, right? He's looking at different cultures. He's looking possibly at his own life, and he's thinking, there are things that are going wrong. But then he's like, but wait a minute. When I say that things are going wrong, I'm using some sort of standard. And when I say that I'm using some sort of standard, I'm not just appealing to what I like, right? My own personal feelings and preferences, because again, if it's just that, well, then someone else can use their own personal preferences and opinions. They're completely contrary to mine, and neither one of us is any more right or wrong. But Lewis was saying, no, I wasn't saying that it was just my opinion that things weren't right or wrong, that there really were things, not just my opinion, but according to something that things just aren't right here, right? And he's saying, but wait a minute, on my atheism, there was no such thing as an ultimate or objective standard, right? And he's like, so my argument against God, hey, all this is so bad, all this is so unfair, it just disappeared, right? It was only if things really are really bad, really unfair, that you could bring that problem to God, right? Because God would have to exist in order to establish some sort of standard, right, outside of yourself or culture or whatever. So the logical problem, as we've seen, has been resolved, right? Now, of course, that's not to say that there aren't a couple of people here and there. You'll find a smattering that will still try to argue that. But by and large, within the philosophical community, though, especially within the philosophy of religion, most in the know have let that go, that problem, the logical version. Now, they've tried to formulate different arguments, but strictly speaking, the logical problem has by far been conceded, right? Now, we still have the emotional problem of evil. Now, the emotional problem of evil is, again, distinct and different from the intellectual or the logical problem, but needless to say, of course, it needs to be addressed, right? And this is where you can start to bring in theodicies. This is when you can start to deal with the why question of why God might or might not allow some sort of particular event. Now, we would have examples, like Christian theists would use examples from their own scriptures for something like this, right? So they would say that, look, we know that God uses particularly bad events, evil events, and uses them for the good. So, for instance, the Christian theist could point to the story of Joseph, right? He's sold into slavery, his brothers betray him, just all of these bad events. He goes into prison, but then the scriptures there tell the story of how God uses these experiences to literally bring him to be second in command of the most powerful nation at the time. And then when they go into a famine, because of these experiences, because of these things that Joseph has had to deal with and go through in his life, the betrayal of his brothers, the selling into slavery, going into prison, it is only because of that was basically the road that led him to the place of power and prominence, holding second in command to Egypt and saving the entire nation because of his experiences, and then even being reunited with his brothers in the process, right? So Christian theism would say that Scripture even paints the picture, right? There's past precedent, right? If we use legal jargon, there's precedent set that God does, in fact, work in this way. Of course, the biggest would be, they would point to, the Christian theist would point to the cross, right? That, according to Christian theism, that God takes the most heinous, ugly, evil, wrong, immoral event ever to have happened within not just the earth, but the universe, right? The crucifying and the murder of Jesus himself. And he takes that event, right, the most heinous, horrific event, and uses that to literally save all of mankind. So essentially taking the most horrific, ugly, evil, heinous event and making that the most beautiful, honorific, salvific, all these words that you could use, these attributes, these superlatives, makes that the best thing that could ever have happened in the universe, because he reverses, he undoes the evil by its own means, right? He uses that, turns it on its head, and makes it something beautiful, right? Now, an up and coming thinker, Vince Vitale, would say something like this. Have we actually even seriously considered just our own freedom, right? We complain about the others, all the evil being done, but have we ever considered the role in which we play, right? Just our own freedom, right? Have you ever used your own freedom, right? Your own ability to make choices to harm another individual, whether it be psychologically, emotionally, perhaps, tragically, even physically? Have you ever used your own freedom, right? It basically meaning we usually, when we talk about this aspect of free will, the problem of evil, and all these sorts of things, it's always in regard to someone else using their powers. Well, why didn't God stop them, right? Why didn't God keep them from doing some particular evil action? Have we ever asked that about ourselves? That really it could be someone thinking from your past, why didn't God stop you, right? Yet we see the value in having this ability to choose, and then even choose for the worse, right? And so this is something that Vince Vitale says we need to really ask ourselves the serious question: have we considered our own contribution to evil in the world, not from someone else, but from ourselves, right? Now, I want us to think this, right? Remember, the problem of evil is not only a theistic problem, right? All worldviews, you can't say that there's the problem of evil and then therefore Christianity is false and then evil disappear. Your worldview, my worldview, right? Any worldview is going to have to somehow go and answer and deal with and wrestle with the problem of evil, right? So let's just say, for sake of argument, the problem of evil, you reject, say, Christian theism or whatnot because of the problem of evil. Well, what does your worldview do with the problem of evil? Right? It's still there. It doesn't, because you reject one particular worldview, it doesn't get rid of this fact that we experience evil, right? In fact, some thinkers have noted that Bertrand Russell, famous atheistic philosopher of the 20th century, part of his rejection of Christian theism was the problem of evil. He said you couldn't take seriously the idea of an all good God, right, all powerful God, while sitting beside the bed of a child with cancer, dying. And a bit forthrightly and bluntly, Christian theists said, "Well, what do you say, Bertrand Russell? What do you say to the child dying of cancer on their bedside? Sorry, tough luck. On atheism, some get it, some don't get it. On atheism, some live, some die. On atheism, this crap happens, right? The problem didn't go away for you. Now you just have the problem and zero hope. Now you just have the problem and the kid dies, right? Now, again, that was very forthright and very blunt, but the point was just simply to say you didn't solve the problem. In fact, you may have made it worse, is what they would argue there, right? Now that's true again. How does Christian theism answer the problem of evil? How does pantheism answer the problem of evil? Many times it would say that evil itself is an illusion of some sense, right? That there's just really not evil. New Age belief really would go after that too. Atheism has to answer it. All these worldviews have to go with this problem of evil and address it in some sense. And then, so the question would be: is that sufficient? How does each answer this qualitative aspect of life? And then, is it sufficient? And is it livable? Right. So, under your worldview, is that answer that you have, right? Is that actually a livable? Is it existentially viable, as we might say? Um, so is Bertrand Russell's view, how his worldview solves the problem of evil, is that even livable? Is it viable? Is it livable? Is it existentially viable to say, if I'm some sort of new age practitioner, that evil is just an illusion? That when I watch something happen to some child, well, that's really just, there really are no moral categories. That's just, I just think it's evil. But what's happening to the little girl right now? It's just an illusion in some sense. You got to ask yourself these questions, right? Now, we don't have time to go into this. You'll probably get into this in some of our theology courses, but essentially some might say, well, if God created all things and evil's the thing, well, then God created evil. Augustine answered this. I'm just going to toss this out quickly. You've already got enough to think about, but essentially Augustine basically argued, and I think he's correct here, that evil exists as a privation, meaning that evil is not a thing in the proper sense. But that's not to say that evil is an illusion or that it doesn't exist. It's simply that evil exists just as a hole in the wall exists, right? It's the lack of what is, or it's the lack of what ought to be there, right? So blindness, right? Blindness exists as a privation, right? I can't give you some blindness. I can take what ought to be there, your sight, right? I can't give you a hole through the arm, right? But I can shoot right a hole or take flesh, right? So evil exists in the sense that there's something good that is lacking, right? It's a lack, right? It's the lacking of what ought to be, right? That's how evil exists. So Thomas Aquinas might jokingly ask, or might jokingly say, if someone says, well, on your view, Aquinas, evil doesn't really exist. And then he says something, the joke there is something about, run through the forest and you fall down into a hole, into a pit, and then, tell me the hole didn't exist, right? No, it exists. It's just not on a list of things, right? But again, those are ontological and metaphysical categories that we don't necessarily have time to get to. Maybe we could discuss that in a metaphysics course, something like that. But essentially, the evil exists as a privation. So, if I create the wall and there's a hole in the wall, well, I didn't make the hole, right? Somebody comes along after me and takes what ought to be there. So it can be said truthfully that I made the wall, but I didn't make the hole, even though the hole is there and it's real. But in one sense, it's only there because something was taken that should be there, right? Now, we could go into a lot of thoughts and conclusions here. I'm sure that your mind is racing. I'm sure it's going all over the place, right? Sit down, think about this, ponder over this. I've actually written a paper in regard to this. If you want that, I can try to. You can send me an email. Hopefully, I can send that to you if you want to look at it. Um, but I want to end with this. I want to end with what I would call this minimalistic theodicy. When I say minimalistic theodicy, and again, this is someone that's actually going through evil, I think it's a fair, and I would even say appropriate response to say, I don't know why you're dealing with what you're dealing with. I just know that God knows what we don't know. And that somehow, some way, per Romans, chapter 8, that he's working the good out of this somehow. I'm not going to sit here and pretend and say, oh, well, you do know that if you weren't going through this, then you wouldn't be able to, or if you did, shut up, right? Be quiet. Sit with the person, cry with the person, and just say, I don't know. Right now, we just have to trust in God's goodness that somehow, so I'm not saying you have to like it. I'm not saying that dismisses it. You're telling the person this. I'm not saying that this is going to make it okay right now. God knows what we don't know, and I'm sorry that you're dealing with this, right? Let me give you one example, and you may have heard something similar to this before, but to me, this is very potent. Please excuse me if I start crying, right? I'm one of those guys, man, the older you get, the more I start crying about everything, right? But I've got a little boy, and like I said, he's 4, but when he was 2 years old, it was one of the first instances at the doctor in which I had to take him in, right? Now, he had a very serious health issue, but I don't even think we need to go into that. I think that we can just use just one that you yourself have probably experienced if you have children. And even if you haven't had children, you can relate to in some sense. But I took him in, to the doctor there, and he had to receive, it was one of the times when you get all the shots at once, like 3 shots at once, maybe even 4 for some sort of vaccinations and whatnot, right? Now my little boy is 2 years old. He doesn't even know my middle name at that point. He probably doesn't even know my last name, but he knows me, right? He knows I'm his dad, and he knows that I love him, right? For the most part, that's all he knows. That I'm his dad, that I love him, and that I can, pick him up, and I'm strong, right? In his view, I'm strong. I can stop all sorts of things, right? I can do all sorts of things, right? So I'm sorry, I should have added that. That he knows that I'm his daddy. He knows that I love him, and he thinks that I'm strong, right? That's all he knows. He doesn't even know my name, my middle name. Doesn't even know my last name, right? He knows I'm his dad. Well, when I take him in, everything's happy-go-lucky. Everything's fine at first. Um, then he noticed the nurse come into the room, right? The doctor's already come, already left, nothing too substantial, but the nurse comes in, right? Now the nurse has the awful task of having to administer the shots, right? The vaccinations and whatnot. Now I lay my little boy down on the table, right? And of course he's already confused. Well, why are you doing this, Dad, right? Well, that first shot goes into him, right? It goes into the 2-year-old. When my little boy looks at me, his daddy, and remember, he knows that I love him, right? And he knows that I could stop this, right? Whatever this person just did, he knows that I can stop that, right? He knows I can stop it. But I don't. I don't stop it. And with the first shot, it catches him completely by surprise. So he's not screaming yet, but those tears rather, immediately start to well up, and a tear runs down his face, and he's looking at me confused as to why I let that happen, right? Now, not only did I let that happen, but I'm holding him down. I am in some very real sense the one who's causing it in a way. I'm holding him there. Not only am I not stopping this, but I'm holding him there. So that was the first. Now the second comes in. Now he has just a wild-eyed look, right? The second shot. He knows that I love him. He knows I could stop that. Not only am I not stopping it, but I'm holding it and I'm allowing it to continue. Of course, now he's really crying, right? He's looking up at me, his daddy, who's supposed to be loving and who's supposed to be powerful enough to stop this, right? And I'm not. In fact, I'm holding him there. Then the third shot. Then the fourth, right? Of course, this entire time he's screaming, he's begging me, his daddy, stop this, right? Daddy, please don't let them do this to me. And yet, again, not only am I allowing it, but I'm holding him down to let it happen, right? Now, here's the question. Why am I doing that? Because I know what he doesn't know, right? I know that that's happening to him, and I know it hurts. And I'm not going to lie, and I'm not going to say it doesn't. It does. It does hurt. It does, even because he's 2 years old, it even breaks his heart that his daddy's allowing this. But at that point, all my son can do, all he can do, whether this probably doesn't come to his consciousness, right? And his immediate conscious reflective capabilities, but all he can do at that point is trust that I know what he doesn't know, right? Of course, I could try to go into germ theory and the importance of vaccination and all of it, but is that going to make any sense to him at 2 years old? No. And so all he can do at that point is I don't know what's going on right now. I don't know why my daddy's allowing this. I don't know why it seems to be the fact that he's holding me here, but I have to trust that he knows something that I do not know. I have to believe that he knows something that I don't know. And so that's what I would call my minimalistic theodicy. That when these things happen, when we are going through these rough aspects, don't pretend to know why someone's dealing with what they're dealing with. Don't pretend to just say, I don't know. But we've got to trust that our Father knows, right? We've got to trust that when it's over, he will no longer, it won't go on for any longer time than absolutely necessary. But when it's over, even if that's the other side, right, that God will immediately, when it's over, pick you up and hold him and pull you to himself, right? So that what I would say is the minimalistic theodicy. Hope you got something new out of this. I know you're getting a lot of this in your courses. Hope there was even maybe just something small, something that you could get out of this. And so with that said, we'll pick up with our next lecture.